Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. After a deadly year for French women, tens of thousands of people came out to march against the domestic violence rates in the country. In response, the French government took a number of steps to reduce the number of women killed by violence each year. However, France isn't the only country in which domestic violence rates are rising at an alarming rate. As monitoring and reporting becomes more prevalent across the world, there is a greater recognition of how many individuals, especially women, are victims of violence. The World Health Organization states that nearly 1 in every 3 of women worldwide have experienced either physical partner violence or non-partner violence in their lifetime. On today's show, we take a closer look at what continues to perpetuate the cycle of violence and what can be done to protect vulnerable individuals around the world. Joining us for this discussion today is Dr. Aleksandra Djuric, who's a psychologist joining us from Belgrade. Also joining us is Dr. Rashawn Ray, a sociologist and a Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He joins us from Washington. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. Ray, I'd like to begin with you. Now, as I stated, there is a system of violence that is existing, and something is causing it to continuously reproduce itself, but also aggravate it, and it's worsening with the rising numbers that we're seeing. Do you think that there are some social factors that attribute to what we're seeing now?
Yes, there are definitely social factors that contribute to the increasing rise of domestic violence worldwide. I think that the broad points are, first, the labor market does impact domestic violence. So across the world, when jobs are more scarce, when people are more worried about their occupations, particularly men, and we've seen that in France compared to other countries in Europe, that unemployment is rising, that the ability to get jobs is rising, and men intricately tie masculinity to their ability to work. And then when they can't do that, they oftentimes act that out on women. I think some of the other things that's happening across the world, but in this case, we're talking about France as well as the United States and others, is that there is a big lack of accountability, particularly for men or any person who commits domestic violence, to be held accountable legally. So yes, there might be some people who file a report, who actually end up going to court in some sort of way. But the penalty is very, very small. And I think that's one of the things that French activists are really upset about, that there is still a lack of accountability, that you can end up getting very little time for actually beating an intimate partner. As you noted, about 1 out of 3 women worldwide are impacted by this. So we see these broader labor market shocks where men are grappling with their masculinity. And then on the other hand, we see a lack of accountability as it relates to the government to hold people actually accountable for the incidents that they engage in.
Right. Dr. Ray, you make 2 very important points, but I want to dig a little deeper into the first one you're making about the labor market and how that is causing men to grapple with their masculinity. Let's unpack that a little more. What does it actually mean when a man or any individual does not have the security of a job or an earning? How does that lead to more violence and aggression?
Boys are socialized to work and provide. And when your identity is linked and really tied to your ability to provide, what ends up happening is that when you're unable to do that, then you try to find other ways to express your masculinity. And one of the main ways that men then express their masculinity is exhibiting dominance over women. So providing in the household and being the lead provider isn't just about making the most money. It's also about showing that you can be the head of the household. And when men are unable to do that, then they aim to act out their masculinity in other ways, which oftentimes comes with aggression. It comes with frustration. It comes with physical violence. And this is because men are socialized to actually act out their emotions in ways that that's unhealthy. And so when men are unable to perform the provider role, then they look to other ways to perform their masculinity, which means they double down on their dominance over women. And typically that doesn't just involve verbal abuse or emotional abuse. Oftentimes it really involves physical abuse, which can then transfer over to children and transfer also over into the community.
Right. Dr. Djuric, now, as we're talking about this, and Dr. Ray talked about the socialization process, which causes men to, adopt certain gender roles. We're going to talk about that in greater depth later on in the show as well. But specifically linked to violence, now there is an argument to be made about the nature of men, something that is inherent, something that is not caused or created by the environment. Is there something about men and aggression that makes us see such alarming rates?
Yes, when we see culture, we can learn that from young age, men are taught not to be sad. Some emotions are not, in family, are not provided. So often men confuse when they are sad or when they have emotion of fear, they are aggressive. I'm sad, oh, I will be angry. I feel fear, I will be angry. So yes, that is culture. That is emotion that is learned in family, and it is cultural provided. I can say that.
So the inability to differentiate between emotions, sadness and anger, causes the conflation of both emotions. That's what you're saying.
Sadness and fear. When they feel sadness and fear, often they in behavior they show aggression.
Right. Now, Dr. Ray, as we're talking about aggression and the reasons why men might feel certain things, there is something about exerting power that is linked to violence, and a lot of literature sheds light on this, how the act of violence itself is about exhibiting power. Now, you mentioned the labor market in this case and how that changing is causing us to see rising numbers. But what other factors do you think link to this entire concept of trying to exert your power within the household through violence?
I think one of the other factors, it still focuses on the labor market, but actually from the other side. So when men are struggling for work, and oftentimes these are manufacturing jobs, these are more physical laborers jobs, oftentimes they also then see women participating in the labor force. So part of what happens is traditionally around the world and in most countries, it's been the fact that men are supposed to provide and go outside of the household and work, and women are supposed to be on the inside taking care of children. Well, when men struggle with employment and when the labor market changes and actually gives women the ability to obtain equitable participation in the labor market and equitable participation when it comes to obtaining higher incomes, then oftentimes that balance, particularly when men are struggling with employment, can lead to men feeling even more aggressive and feeling like they need to act out that aggression against women who are actually making progress in the labor force. So they're actually making this comparison between themselves and women. I think, again, the other big thing is the fact that governments are simply not aiming to regulate this in the way that they should. And oftentimes this is because domestic violence, even though we're talking about it as a big increase for men who struggle with employment, is something that men exhibit across the socioeconomic gradient. Right. So you have politicians, you have athletes, you have entertainers, you have wealthy people who are also engaging in domestic violence in the same way because they've been socialized, as we just heard, through various acts in their childhood to exhibit dominance and power over women. So it's not just like that only men who are struggling with employment are doing it. Oftentimes men, regardless of their background, have been socialized that when they have a bad day, when they're sad, when they get angry, when they get fearful, when they get scared, that the best way to exhibit those particular emotions is to act out aggression in their behavior, and they act that out against women.
Right. Dr. Djuric, I want to go back to you and talk to you a little more about this stereotyping, the socialization, and the experiences. Now, one thing, and many studies point towards it, is childhood and the role it plays in violence that is acted out in adulthood. Studies show that when children at a young age experience violence, they have greater chances of perhaps repeating that forms of violence. Could you shed light on that?
Yes, of course. In early childhood, in period from until birth and until 7 years old, we are in a period of socialization, and we learn how to be a good how to be a good member of society. In society, which are not good role models, and in family that cannot provide and teach children how to be a well-adapted member of society, we can have situations like this, because in childhood, early childhood, we learn how to behave, how to deal with problems, how to deal with our emotion in our family. Our primarily role models are our parents. If they don't know how to cope with problems, if they, when they have problem and some emotional intensity, and when they act aggressively and show violence toward that child, that is a role model for that child, and it's and that child will deal with problems and emotions like that role model in family.
Right. Thanks so much, Dr. Aleksandra Djuric, for joining us and talking to us about this important issue. Dr. Ray, talking about this, a cycle of violence that repeats itself from a person who was probably a victim of violence to becoming the perpetrator of violence. Now, in this entire cycle, it's almost as if we're talking in terms of inevitability. But is there a way to take control?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, I think the first thing, as you just mentioned, people have to realize that hurts people. And part of thinking through that is that people are socialized to then act out their aggression based on what they've actually experienced. I do think that things that can be done, I think it's on multiple levels. First, you have the governmental level. Mm-hmm. There needs to be more regulation at the government level. And what that means is more regulation, to be specific, means stricter policies and laws. When I worked at Indiana University, I was the outreach coordinator for the Office for Women's Affairs. And I did a lot of work working with women who were victims of domestic and sexual violence. And one of the biggest issues that they talked about is that when they then came forward, that there wasn't any due process, particularly quick enough to hold the perpetrator accountable. And then what happened is they were put right back in that same situation with the perpetrator knowing that they actually reported that information because the court system was too slow, because the penalties were not severe enough. So we have to be very clear that people in France this is what they're asking for. They're asking for stricter policies. And so that is one thing that can happen. I think the other thing that can happen is employers can then get involved. Companies need to do something about this as well. They're not simply oblivious to this.
Dr. Ray, sorry to interrupt you. As you talk about penalties, another question that does come to my mind, and this often comes up in debate, is penalty and is punishment going to act as a form of deterrence when we're talking about something that is so deeply ingrained in a person because of this entire way they have been brought up and the environment they have been brought up in?
Yeah, so on one hand, you have the penalties that's going on. The other thing, what can you do about the person? I think part of what can be done about the person is there literally has to be a resocialization process. And what that looks like is individuals who are experts, counselors, psychiatrists, psychologists, coming in and actually working with men to resocialize men to rethink their own masculinity. Part of the main issue is that men have a very limited view of what masculinity is. And by showing them a broader view of masculinity, that their masculinity isn't only linked to their ability to provide, but is actually linked to their ability to also perform the other family roles, including being a caregiver to their children, including being a houseworker in the household. And so part of it is expanding the scope of what masculinity is, and then it's helping men to actually cope with their emotions. So we've been talking a lot about anger and sadness and fear. And this is because when men exhibit those emotions, the only thing they've been socialized to do. And the main thing they've seen they've been inundated in their household, also in mainstream media and everywhere, that when you exhibit these emotions, you become more aggressive. So we have to help men better cope with their emotions. And that's giving them a broader view of what masculinity is, giving boys better examples of what masculinity is. And then over time, we will start to see men exhibit better coping strategies to reduce the likelihood of domestic violence.
Right. On that point, I'd like to introduce Kamla Bhasin, who is an Indian developmental feminist and poet and a social scientist. She joins us from Jaipur. Thank you so much, Ms. Bhasin. As I was in conversation with Dr. Ray about the entire way resocialization needs to happen for men, from a Southeast Asian perspective, when we're looking at how socialization happens here and how the unique challenges confront both genders, what do you think needs to be done in this resocialization process to help men better be aware of their sensitive nature, be better aware of violence being wrong and not perpetuating the system?
First of all, my experience tells me that a lot of people do not understand the whole concept of gender. They mix it up with sex. So I just want to say that gender is the way society defines us. It has nothing to do with nature. So that means it is society which says you are a girl, you will behave like this, you will dress like this, you will act like this, your rights will be these, your responsibilities will be these. And that means we do the same to boys. You will not cry, you will not be afraid, you will dominate, you have entitlements, etc. So if it is created by society, then we can change it if it is harming us and if it is harming society. And I
Ms.
think
Bhasin, you've been a word there that I'd just like to pick up, your entitlements. Now, there is this entire idea of men being entitled to women's bodies, and therefore the violence, the act of violence is carried out in such a systematic manner. Let's dig deeper into that. Do you think that perception is changing?
Well, I mean, to some extent, definitely it is changing. We have worked so hard for the last 4 or 5 decades on this. So yes, both women and men are changing, but not to the extent we would like it to change. And although we feminists have worked on changing it, our governments have tried through our constitutions, etc. But then there are other forces which are pushing us behind. And one big force, which I call capitalist patriarchy. You look at media, what they're doing. You look at the ads, what they're doing. You look at toys for boys and girls, what they're doing. Another phenomena is religious fundamentalism, which is also gendering men in very terrible ways. Similarly, militarization. So, on the one hand, feminists have fought to change things. On the other hand, these huge forces, much, much bigger than what we've been able to do. And that's why the progress is not adequate, and we still have to do a lot of work all over the world. I mean, look at some of our presidents in the world, the kind of language they use, and not just in our countries. I mean, look at the president in the United States of America. I mean, the kind of
the language that is being used, the thing being said, of course, I take your point there. Dr. Ray, now, as Ms. Bhasin talked about the capitalist patriarchy being a force that is hindering the progression of, women being powerful, being entitled to their own rights, all of this. Now, when we talk about oppression, there's obviously someone at the back end that is benefiting from one person's oppression. When we're talking about capitalist patriarchy, who is benefiting from this, the perpetuation of this violent system?
I mean, men are fundamentally benefiting from a capitalist patriarchal society. And so what that means is whenever equality is being pursued, the people who are going to lose power are never going to give that up easily. But I do think that there's a growing number of men who, and I think a lot of these men have always been around, who actually don't believe in that particular system. Either they don't necessarily know what to do about it, but those who do, they also fear repercussions of speaking up. There are a series of social repercussions at play that could also then spill over into the labor market for these men if they speak up and speak out. And what we need to do is to get men and women together who do want to speak up and speak out and start talking more about it. So when we look at protests in France, it doesn't just simply need to be women. There need to be men walking side by side, because I tend to think that when we talk about certain forms of oppression, the people who are most likely positioned to change it are the people who benefit the most from it. And so when we talk about a capitalist patriarchal society, men are really benefiting. I mean, you put those two words together, patriarchy, you're talking about maleness in many regards, and capitalistic, you're talking about capital. You're talking about the labor market and money. And this is why for men, their masculinity is intricately tied to their labor force participation, their ability to obtain money and take care of the household, because taking care of the household and bringing in all the money suggests then I have all the power, and then I can take full ownership over everyone's bodies in the house, including the women that are in my household. So part of this is recognizing how deep a capitalist patriarchal society goes and what it means for male masculinity.
Right. Ms. Bhasin, do you feel like needs to be the step forward? And as we talked about, France, after so much public pressure, introduced a number of steps. They introduced a national action plan for domestic violence specifically. But this is a global issue. What do you think needs to be done in our part of the world?
No, first of all, I really don't think men are benefiting in the long run. I think that's a myth. I feel men are being harmed tremendously by patriarchy. And in capitalist societies, all men don't benefit. The black men don't benefit, the Dalits don't benefit, the minority men don't benefit, the poor men don't benefit. I think this myth that patriarchy is harming only women and not harming men. I personally feel that patriarchy is dehumanizing men. It is brutalizing men. Someone needs to sit down with them to make them understand the pressure patriarchy creates for men, the burdens it creates for them. We women have started thinking about patriarchy because, yes, the shoe pinches us much more. But men are also harmed, and they need to think. And they need to think about it not because they have to help us women. I think men need to think about it because they need to save themselves from patriarchy. And if men behave, if they learn not to be patriarchal, not to be dominating, then we women are okay. I mean, then we will not be raped, and then we will not be violated, and then there will not be domestic violence. So I think this is what men and boys need to understand, that being gentle, being nice, being caring, will lead to love, will lead to better relationships all around, and it is not a battle between men and women. Right. This is a battle between patriarchy on one side and all of us on the other side. And this is what we need to realize. I do not consider this a battle between men and women. It is a battle between two ideologies. One ideology says patriarchy is better. The other says, no, sorry, equality is better.
Right. Ms. Bhasin, I take your point there, and that's a very strong point to make, that men are also harmed by the system of oppression that we think is solely geared towards women. They too are harmed, and they shouldn't want it to change just for the sake of women and their progress, but for their own progress. On that point, I'd like to thank Ms. Kamla Bhasin for joining us from Jaipur. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we take a look at how the global discussion regarding masculinity has been changing. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. The gender debate has been changing. More people, men and women both, have been challenging stereotypes and negative values. But with the conversation, how has the perception of masculinity changed? That's our discussion today. Joining us to explore the topic in depth is Dr. Rashawn Ray, sociologist and Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Afia Salam, activist and journalist, joining us from Karachi, and Dr. Vala Ragnarsdottir, who's the professor of sustainability science at the University of Iceland, joining us from Iceland. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. Ray, now let me continue with you. In our earlier segment, we were talking about something similar. We were talking about domestic violence and how negative stereotypes and negative values perpetuate that system. On our last note, we talked about how men need to fight against patriarchy for their own sake. Do you think men are reckoning with this reality all over the world? Do you think they are realizing this as well?
What it means to be a man in the 21st century. And that's been different from any way that masculinity and what it means to be a man has meant before. And I do think, particularly in the United States and other countries, for example, the number of men who now provide caregiving, who do housework in the household, has significantly increased over the past quarter century. So I do think that men are recognizing this. A large reason for this is because women's participation, labor market participation, is significantly increasing. So what that means is that men are recognizing that in order for us to live the lifestyle we want, in order for us to survive, my wife must also work outside of the household, which means I should now take more responsibility inside of the house. I think we're seeing that. I think on the other hand, though, men who are struggling with employment, men who are underemployed, meaning that they make a lot less money than they think they should, I think we still see differences there. But I do think that men are trying to grapple with this. And I do think we're starting to see more displays of a variety of masculine presentations. And I think that's what's very, very key, is again, that when something happens badly or difficult in a man's life, men have always been socialized to act out that particular feeling and aggression. And so by putting men in other men's lives to show them that there are other ways to exhibit masculinity, I think we're starting to see a lot of change. Not as much as we would like to see, but we are seeing massive change from the past quarter century compared to before.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Rashawn Ray, for just and talking to us about all of this. Ms. Afia Salam, now, as Dr. Ray talked about it, that being a man in today's age is different than any other time. Why do you think that is? And what role do you feel like women have played in this change of perception?
Well, actually, I mean, I would agree that this is a generational change, and you wouldn't see as many men being even, as caregivers or even acknowledging that they could have a role other than the one that society had given to them of being the provider, and, they have to put their bread on the table and they have to be outside while the woman's domain was inside the house. So that has changed for a variety of factors that he has mentioned. But there is also that realization that it shouldn't be on a need basis, the realization that this is how it should always have been, that they are equal partners in a relationship, should also be equal partners in the responsibilities and sharing. So that has been slow in coming. And yes, the newer generation has grown up with seeing more women in the workplace, and they have seen women, tackle tasks outside the house as well as inside. And those who have actually, it's not out of force. So you can't, I don't think that it is happening in households where the woman has been turning around and telling the man, look, I do this outside. So when we are at home, you need to do this as well. Because that's a confrontational approach. Right. And the best thing of tackling is if you are actually cognizant and if you are empathetic to that role and you realize that this is something we should be doing together. So over there, the transition is much better. It's smoother. It's cordial. It's actually very, very sort of affectionate, But otherwise, but that change is slow. So I also agree that the earlier generation wasn't as good at it, and the newer generation is, because they see the role of women outside the house also, and the women are proving themselves that they can do whatever men could do. It's not, the two domains are so totally different from each other that they cannot do things.
Right.
So that realization, I think, is also bringing the kind of change that we are seeing.
Right. It's that realization. It's a generational change. I get your points there, Ms. Salam. Dr. Ragnarsdottir, I just want to jump to you and talk to you about this. Now, in all of this, we have been talking about gender equality and the fact that more people are realizing that that should be the ambition, that people should strive towards it. Now, you are talking to us from Iceland, and Iceland has been continuously ranked as being at the top when it comes for gender equality. What do you think the reason for that is?
Iceland elected the first woman in a democratic election as a president in 1980. And she then was our president for 16 years and served as a role model for all the girls in Iceland growing up then. I think that is very important. We also established a women's party because women in Iceland felt that the political parties were not putting women high enough on the list, so they were not represented enough in parliament, and that was also in the 80s. And since then, a number of legislations have been put into force, and we have been very much sort of working on these issues along with the other Nordic countries, so that there is an equality between men and women, and also men can take paternity leaves and become an active member in running the household and bonding with the children, which I think has been very important.
Right. Ms. Salam, just to jump back to you, how important do you think it is for female representation in political roles for us to reach that point where we can say, all right, now we are talking about equality, now we're moving forward?
Okay, so it is important, definitely, that they should be seen in all spheres. And Pakistan on that score has not done too badly, because don't forget, we elected a woman prime minister decades ago. And generally, Muslim countries and societies are seen as very, very conservative. But we had a woman candidate for the top slot in politics way back in the 40s, in the 60s, when the earlier elections were taking place. Fatma Jinnah, who was sister of the founder of the country. And also, we've had seats in the parliament which were, as an affirmative action, allocated that these number of seats have to be, filled by women. So those things are important enough to get people used to seeing women in these different spheres. And they can also legislate to kickstart the process of mainstreaming women. But it's the societal change, the behavior change, which is a slower process. And this is why I said that you can see this change over a generation. Usually, 25 years, which the doctor had mentioned, that is counted almost as a whole generation. Right. And this is a slow process. But I think it is happening. It is happening maybe at a faster rate in urban areas where there's slightly more literacy. There's more interaction between... There's
variance, but it is happening. We're on the way. Ms. Salam, stay with me. I also want to introduce Klint Janulis, who's a cognitive researcher joining us from Oxford. Thank you so much, Klint, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, Klint, we're having this discussion about masculinity, and it's only fair to get the male perspective in all of this. Now, how do you think masculinity, in the eyes of men especially, I'm not talking about specifically feminist voices and their narratives, but men, are they seeing a change in the definition? Are they wanting a change in the definition?
I think the current newer generation of men definitely want a change. They're working towards a change in the definition. And that definition is fairly important because I also think there's sort of a transitional generation that were brought up in one cultural tradition of what it means to be a male, to be masculine. And a lot of times they tend to be working class, like where I'm from, and things are changing very rapidly. And that sort of transition that's happening is sort of at the point, it seems to me, fairly unidirectional. There's a lot of spaces that were traditionally male being opened up for women, and a lot of the roles that were traditionally female are not really being made accessible to men, either culturally or through status. They're still sort of viewed as less than. So for a lot of men with traditional understandings of what it means to be a male, they're losing some of their spaces, but there's not new spaces opening up for them, at least in how they understand it.
Great. Ms. Salam, now Klint makes a very interesting point, and he's specifically talking about how the alienation is occurring, and he's talking about different segments of society in which this discussion is happening. When we're talking about gender, do you feel like academia is sometimes alienating for certain classes, for certain people who do want to have this discussion about gender, but they don't find the language accessible or relatable?
So I would agree there, because this is a new discourse. And, you know what he was saying, that men are feeling uneasy. It's because of the tone. Usually if the tone is confrontational, then, you know, the guard is up. And then they feel, you know, that they are getting the raw end of the deal. The women are getting more and they are losing their space. So I think that there needs to be a lot more maturity and rationality introduced into the discourse, which really now needs to graduate from the earlier resting of space and the tug of war into a mature discussion that, you know, these are the things that can be done by anybody who feels up to it, who feels they are able to, and who should not be labeled as this is a woman's thing that they are doing, or this is a man's thing that a woman is doing. Right. So this again, you know, like I said, behavior change is slow. This is a slow process, and I'm confident that the newer generation will have crossed these hurdles by the time, you know, they reach a level where everybody is working in the same space.
Right. Klint, jumping back to you and getting a last comment on what you said was the reason behind many people feeling alienation, especially when we're talking about the gender discourse. Now, how do you think it can become a more inclusive conversation?
Defining the language we're using, and two, I think, as mentioned, making the conversation a discussion and not accusational. And that really goes a long ways. And as somebody who entered academia late in life, I really struggled with the terminology of the social sciences. And it took me a while to learn what it meant. So I can only imagine what it's like for many of my friends and family growing up in working class Kansas who hear some of these conversations, and it just sounds like a foreign language and often sounds very attacking. And I grew up on a farm where everybody pretty much had to contribute equally. I learned how to run the farm from my mother. My grandmother taught me how to hunt. So I didn't have this understanding of gender roles being so fixed. And it was only when I left and got into the greater society that I realized the discussion on this was quite different than what I understood. So I think just realizing there are a lot of cultural differences is important.
Right. That's an important point that you're making there. Dr. Ragnarsdottir, just a last comment from you before we wrap up the show now. Talking about gender equality and the way forward, how important do you think is that when we're talking about sustainable development and a sustainable future?
Well, I actually asked my PhD students this question before this show started, and I knew I would be asked questions of this genre. I asked them, how do you see gender equality as being important for society? And one of them, actually a male student, said, I think it's a prerequisite to a modern society to have gender and minority equality. So I think this is very much the view of the young people, that we all need to be working together. And actually, for sustainable development, that is an absolute key, that everybody's voice is at the table when we are deciding how to find solutions to the present challenges that we are facing.
Right. And that's an important point, and we're going to end on that very point. Thank you so much, Dr. Kristen Vala Ragnarsdottir, for joining us, Klint Janulis and Afia Salam for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next time with more stories, but you can follow us on our social media, indus.news. We will see you next time. Goodbye and take care.